So even on the most conservative speculation that the Great Pyramid is only 4,500 years ago, we're not even anywhere near that now. We're nowhere near the level of sophistication that it took them to build, and we're just guessing as to what kind of technology they had available to them. And as you pointed out, with these vases and with just the alignment to the constellations, the sophistication that's involved in the construction to get stones that are tons of stone that you can't even get a razor blade in between. Like, what the fuck was going on?
Here's the fun thing to entertain us about moving the stone. So all that black granite that came from
500 miles away.
Yeah, but the ones that came from the eastern part of Egypt.
Oh, the Wadi Hammamet quarry that's in the east, in the mountains.
In the mountains of...
it's nowhere near the Nile.
Right, and so they would have had
move it out of ground.
You'd have to go up and down mountains to move these things that were tens of tons, like off cliffs. And because like the narrative is like, oh well, they would have brought these stones up the Nile.
Right.
Well, there's stones out there that are on the other side of the Nile in the mountains. So how did they bring those?
There's enormous stones.
Huge.
Enormous.
Well, there's 1,000-ton stones.
There's evidence. There's multiple statues that I can show you pictures of that there were single piece statues. So you have the unfinished obelisk in the quarry. That's 1,200 tons. But then you have at least 3 or 4 finished statues that were 1,000 tons, single piece granite. And one of them's in a place called Tonne, which is way up in the north in the delta. That's more than 1,000 miles from where that stone came from. And then moving that thing, I mean, it's 1,000. It was around 1,000 tons finished, single piece granite. So moving it, you may be at 1,500 tons or more. Like moving that. There's a quarry in Egypt. I think it's called the Minya Quarry, which has these blocks. They're still attached where they've cut these big blocks out and there's like an image of what looks like a giant pharaoh that's been carved on top of it. They're made from limestone. Now, maybe they were never intended to be blocks or maybe they were never intended to be finished, but if you assume they're blocks, these 2 blocks weigh, I think it's 3,500 and 5,000 tons a piece based on the density of limestone in that region. Like they're not disconnected, but that's the scale. We know there's objects up to like 1,200 tons, but the fact that they moved them 1,000 miles. And we have examples. There's a stone called the Russian Thunderstone. Have you heard of this?
No.
So like in the 1700s, they took a big lump of, I think it's granite or something like that from Finland, and they shipped it to St. Petersburg and they carved it into a statue. It's still there today. It's the Thunderstone. It's an edifice. It weighed... That's it now. Yeah, that's the finished one. This image here is the right one, yeah. So this is how they did it in the 1700s, the Thunderstone. And they moved it around 100, 150 meters a day. It took them forever. And the only way they did this was by basically sinking giant logs into the ground to give them a leverage point for these capstans. And they'd move a system of rails, big steel rails with steel ball bearings behind it. It weighed about 1,500 tons. And just over a period of just very slow grinding and turning with capstans and pulleys and these steel tracks, they move at about 150 meters a day. It took them forever. And in order to get that thing across the water from Finland, they had to construct a giant barge, like a huge barge. And on each side of the barge, they would tie up 3 warships just to try and keep it stable. It's about the same size, same mass as the obelisk that's sitting in this mountainous quarry in Egypt, in Aswan. It's still in the ground. It's like 1,200 tons of granite. And you're expected to believe that they somehow were going to lift this thing up out of a quarry over these basically big hills and mountains of granite and put it on a little ship that's narrowed in this, they call it the harbour there, and it's this tiny little space. I'm like, you're absolutely delusional if you think this was a simple task that could be achieved with primitive methods and then ship that thing 1,000 miles somewhere. It's
when you speculate, when you sit around by yourself, because you've thought about this a lot, how the fuck do you think they did this?
Look, I
take a wild
ass guess. I think there's connections possibly to gravity manipulation. I think anti-gravity had to play a part in moving some of this stuff. I actually think there's some connections to some of the work that's being done with this plasmoid implosion technology, the stuff that Randall's been looking into that's coming back to talk a little bit about. The relationship and the sacred geometry aspects of that are similar to the things that we see in some of these cultures in the past. So that may potentially have something to do with the methods that were used in the past. But I'm convinced it was a form of advanced technology. Now, whether it's our form of technology, because let's face it, we can do things like that today, but it takes hydraulics and diesel powers and cranes and all that stuff. They may have had an entirely different avenue of tech, and that you open up into the realm of resonance and acoustics and anti-gravity. I think resonance in particular might have played a strong role, because that's certainly a feature that you see in some of these older structures, whether it's an accident or not, but some of them are incredibly resonant. The Great Pyramid generates a tone just on its own that comes from the earth in there.
It generates a tone.
It does. It generates a low tone. It's basically
you
coming
can hear
from
it,
the earth.
or is it?
If you're quiet enough, you can, but it's certainly been picked up in a whole number of different experiments where they're measuring the tone. The whole structure does generate a low tone. It's an interesting thing. A lot of these places that typically have a connection to underground water as well. Like we know there's water beneath the Giza Plateau. Places like the Coricancha in Peru, which is also a giant megalithic building. There's an underwater river near there. We always see some form of flowing water associated with it. Whether or not that has something to do with it, I don't know. But it's just in that realm of, I think it's the answers lay in realms of science that are outside of our current understanding, that we should be approaching with an open mind, because we might ultimately learn something from it if we do. Instead of just dismissing it, putting it in a box and said, you know what, we're superior to every civilization that's lived before.
Right.
They're primitive. They did it with primitive methods.
Right.
Done.
Right.
All things are